What's going on, Packer fans? Welcome back to an all-new episode of the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. You can follow the podcast at Pack a Day Podcast. Today, I'm overjoyed once again to be joined by the one and only Sam Monson. You can find him as PFF's lead NFL analyst. You can find him on X or Twitter at PFF_Sam. Of course, he's the co-host of the PFF NFL podcast. Sam, welcome back to Pack a Day. How the heck are you doing?
I'm doing good. Overjoyed. I think that's overselling it a little bit, but I like it. I like it. Strong.
Never. Always great talking to you, Sam. I wanted to start off. It feels like forever ago already that the Packers faced the Lions last Thursday. A lot has happened since then, but I thought it was quite, I don't know if it's probably a bigger statement week one when they go into Kansas City and beat the Chiefs, but still you kind of go into that game. The Vikings and the Bears at the time were 0-3, Packers and Lions both 2-1. Lions had defeated the Packers 3 straight times, including kicking them out of the playoffs basically in week 18 a season ago. Felt like this was maybe going to be a competitive matchup, but it was another huge statement by the Detroit Lions that as of right now, they're basically kings of the NFC North. What did you kind of take away from that game?
Yeah, like it was a different type of statement than the week one Kansas City game. I think they were both important for them for slightly different reasons. The Kansas City one with no Travis Kelce, and the issues that the Chiefs had, they kind of needed to win that one, because if they hadn't been able to beat them without Travis Kelce and with, the other issues that Kansas City had, it would have been like, well, if you can't beat this version of the Chiefs, you can't win like that. You can't win a Super Bowl. Right. So that I think was an important win just to get over that line. But this one was more, the Lions have been pretty good. One disappointing performance in there. But Green Bay had sort of shown up as the real challenger. The Vikings have been pretty bad this season and gotten the bad end of luck, and the Bears have just been terrible. So Green Bay is your threat in the North. And to go in there and just eliminate that immediately, just say, you're not on this level, we're the better team, you might be a surprise package this season, but we are the kings of this division, was a big statement for them. And it was pretty emphatic as well. The way they did it was just as important. They didn't just squeak over the line, get a narrow 1 or 2 point victory, a field goal at the death to make sure. They were the better team from start to finish and really controlled that game and made it look pretty easy. So a really big win for Detroit, and sort of sends the Packers almost back to the drawing board.
Yeah, we know in the NFL, road games can be tough inherently. Thursday night road games are even tougher. So to go into Lambeau, especially Green Bay coming off a really impressive fourth quarter, really not great game against the Saints, but a really impressive fourth quarter. You thought maybe they would have learned their lessons from the first 3 quarters against the Saints and hope to carry over some of the momentum from the fourth quarter. But the fact that Detroit came in Thursday night football on the road, I know it's not a huge travel from Detroit to Green Bay, but still going on the road. And like you said, it wasn't just a meager way. It was like they went in and dominated in the trenches and really bullied Green Bay. I know no Bakhtiari, no Elton Jenkins and some of those sort of things, but Detroit came in and really set the tone early and often, and Green Bay didn't respond until late in that game when it was basically over already.
Yeah, and they really did control the line of scrimmage and dominated from a pass rushing standpoint, and they had turned what had been one of Green Bay's biggest strengths into a weakness. That offensive line for the Packers got absolutely annihilated, not just by Aiden Hutchinson, who's been, Aiden Hutchinson is tied for the league lead right now with 27 pressures with a couple of other guys, but it had been just him. And we talked about that, I think, on the show last week, heading into that game. They need to find alternative sources of pass rush, and they did in this game. And I don't think it was necessarily because, players that have that ability to stepped up. Like John Kaminsky ended up being one of the biggest players in that game. And with the greatest respect to John Kaminsky, he is not that type of player, right? Which means when you're sort of looking for who deserves credit, who deserves blame, you start to focus more on the blame side of that, right? When John Kaminsky is ruining your day, you are having a bad day as an offensive line.
Yeah, the greatest Kaminsky performance in Wisconsin since former Badger Frank Kaminsky was tearing it up for the Badgers. But I digress. What do you make of this Packers team through 4 weeks in the NFL? I think we sort of expected it to be a bit of a roller coaster, a bit of an up and down team, one of the youngest teams in the NFL. They've had some bad injury luck. Jenkins, Jair, Bakhtiari, Devondre Campbell. We can go on and on. They've shown some flashes, but they've also had some pretty really rough stretches against both the Lions and the Saints, particularly these past 2 weeks.
Yeah, they have. I think injuries are definitely a part of it. And I think you're right. This was always likely to be an inconsistent team just because of the youth and the inexperience. When you combine those two things together, though, that's when I think you start to see games like this one, which is, we're down bodies, we don't have the full core, we're definitely getting worse from a talent point of view that we're putting on the field. And in addition to that, the young guys can't necessarily overcome that and, keep things on the straight and narrow. And Jordan Love, we've talked about his accuracy before. I think he is the lowest or the second lowest quarterback in the NFL in terms of adjusted completion rate. He doesn't have that kind of margin for error, right? If you're talking about an offensive line that suddenly stops being one of the best in the league and is now giving pressure at a higher level, Love doesn't have that wiggle room because he's not completing, or he doesn't have an adjusted completion rate of 75, 80%. He's got one that's barely 60%. So now when you start adding in the extra variance and the extra difficulty of pressure on top of that, that's when you start to get games like that where it's just not, the offense isn't efficient enough to pick up that slack.
Yeah, totally agreed. And just on Jordan Love for a moment, I think Matt LaFleur's done some really good things to find some plays and scheme up some plays to get him some open players and find some explosive plays, even if some of them have been pass interference, like the flea flicker against Atlanta. I think he's done a pretty nice job with that overall. But I don't think that this is an offense or a team that can survive without being able to run the football the way that they have basically played so far. And I get there comes a point in time where if you're running the football and you're just going against a brick wall every time, like at some point, you can't just keep running it. You got to just let it rip and throw the football. But they almost didn't even try against Detroit. And part of it, of course, is because they're down 24-3 by the time I think they're on their 13th snap on offense. But at some point, this team is going to have to figure out a way by hook or crook to develop some sort of running game just to keep teams remotely off balance. Because if they don't even respect the running game at all, that is going to make things extremely, extremely difficult on a young first-time quarterback.
And also, they're simply not efficient enough at the passing game to do that. There are teams out there that have in the past sort of essentially just abandoned the run game and said, we're better off passing. We can pass the ball 50 times a game. We don't need to run it. And it's okay. We're not losing here, right? This is not one of those teams. If Jordan Love has to become a passer that puts the ball in the air, 50, 60 times a game and they can't run the ball, the big problem with that is not necessarily how difficult you're making his job, though you probably are. It's more, you can't do that if you're going to be an inefficient, quarterback that's only averaging 6 point whatever yards per carry and has an adjusted completion rate in the low 60s. Like, you have to be able to hit more than 6 out of 10 of those throws if you're going to be passing every down.
Yeah, I think hopefully they sort of have a mini bye coming off a Thursday night going to a Monday night, and then have a real bye immediately following that Monday night game. So they've got some time off to, I think, reassess some things and figure some things out and hopefully play with a better brand of discipline, just a better overall brand of football. But I do think they're going to have to figure some things out because they got annihilated in the trenches against the Lions. 3 quarters of that Saints game was brutal. The 4th quarter against the Falcons game was brutal. So hopefully they can get some of these guys back healthy. Hopefully they can play at just a better level than they had in the better portion of the past 9 quarters and figure something out. Because again, I don't think that they have a formula right now that's sustainable, even to play 500 football the rest of the way if they keep playing the way that they're playing right now. Let's go over a couple players that did play well this past week. I want to go over a player that we've talked about, I think, a couple times already. Rashan Gary, 82.4 grade on defense. It continues to be in limited snaps. You got to think at some point they're going to start ramping him up a little bit more. But still, maybe the biggest positive this season for a player coming off of a torn ACL, that Rashan Gary so far basically looks like Rashan Gary.
Yeah, absolutely. He looks, exactly as good as he looked when he got injured. He looks like one of the best pass rushers in the NFL. And we're in an incredible time right now for insane defensive linemen in the NFL, right? There's half a dozen guys, all of whom you could make an argument for like defensive player of the year in any given year, and they're all playing at the same time. Micah Parsons, TJ Watt, Myles Garrett, Aaron Donald, Chris Jones. The list is getting bigger and bigger. And guys like Aiden Hutchinson are trying to get into that category as well. Max Crosby, who we'll talk about coming up, trying to get into that category. Rashan Gary is in that group, right? The group trying to get into that defensive player of the year type of collection. And maybe 10 years ago, he'd already be in that conversation. But there's so many of these guys right now. But he's playing incredibly well. And I agree with you. Like, look, it's time to start seeing if he can do more. You know what I mean? Like, he's clearly as good as pretty much any pass rusher in the NFL. as we're taking it along slowly, I think at this point, unless there's a doctor screaming in their ear saying, God, don't up his workload. This is
Yeah.
dangerous. It's time to crank it up and let's give him a full-time job again.
Yeah, I totally agree. This Packers defense needs it too. They haven't been good enough against the run. I know Rashan Gary's best as a pass rusher, but he still has a level of physicality at the edge that they need more of right now. I think they need more from their edge rusher in general. Preston Smith, LVN, has not been quite as advertised as a first round pick yet, but there's still obviously some meat on that bone and some progression to go. Kingsley Enagbare, who was sort of the training camp and preseason darlings, had a rough start to the season. Hollins hasn't done anything. So overall, Gary's been great, but in limited snaps, and everyone else at that edge position has not lived up to expectations. So something has to give there. And I think more playing time for Gary could go a long way in maybe just sorting some of that out.
Yeah, I mean, there's nobody keeping him on the bench. You know what I mean?
No.
There's nobody there who you're saying he only needs 20 snaps a game because, look, these guys are tearing it up in his absence. They need him on the field as much as they can get him on the field.
On the opposite side of the ball, I want to talk about a player who might have had his worst game of the season, although it certainly wasn't bad. Still a 70.9 grade from PFF this week. That's Zach Tom, the right tackle. I know there's been a lot of talk of trying to get Green Bay's best 5 offensive linemen on the field. That probably does not include Royce Newman, who has been playing. I think a large part of this is they don't want to move Zach Tom from right tackle because he's played so well there. He was sort of that versatile piece that they could move anywhere if needed, but he's been that guy at right tackle, and I don't think they want to take a young guy who's doing a really nice job at right tackle and all of a sudden move him back to left guard and then move him a bunch of different spots. But your thoughts on Zach Tom through the first 4 weeks of the season so far?
I think he's a good player and a good pass protector. I think he needs to be playing at a tackle spot. Doesn't necessarily need to be right tackle. We saw last season in relief of David Bakhtiari that I think he can do exactly the same job on the left side as well. Now, you don't want him bouncing from one side to the other over the course of the season, but if they want to make a move to swap him to left tackle and do it now, I think that would be okay. Or just keep him where he is and play him where he's playing well, particularly given some of the teams that they face this year, where they actually do face a slate of really good pass rushers that primarily rush off that side. So you might not even be gaining necessarily by moving him to the other side of the line because the better pass rushers are coming from the right side. So yeah, I think Zach Tom looks like a really good high-end pass blocking offensive tackle, regardless of which side of the line. Like the rest of that offensive line, he hasn't been as good as a run blocking player, but it's for a 4th round guy, that's a sacrifice you're more than willing to make.
Yeah, right now, Zach Tom, PFF's 12th best rated offensive tackle, which is obviously great to see from a Packers standpoint. I do want to ask you, though, because this is one of the things that I've sort of been tracking this year. Rashan Gary playing really well in limited snaps at edge. Zach Tom having a nice season at right tackle so far. I was looking through and even, just going through in general and thinking and then kind of going through PFF's grades. This is a league that is won by your top end talent. And it's been great that Green Bay was able to get a bunch of draft picks for Devontae Adams, some draft capital for Aaron Rodgers. And they have this really nice, deep group of young players and young talent on this team. But one of the things that I've sort of been waiting and watching for is, all right, it's great to have fun young players, but you have to develop some of these guys into really high end talent if you want to win at the highest of levels. I'm kind of going through and Jordan Love's having a nice season. Romeo Dobbs having a nice season. Zach Tom, Rashan Gary. There's some guys there, and I think Rashan's probably the exception where he's still playing at a very high level and minimum snaps. But there's not a lot of Packers right now that are on the top 10, top 15, even top 20 of PFF's charts by position. I think that's one of at least my concerns moving forward for this team is there has to be a little bit more of a step up from the Georgia guys. Eric Stokes is coming back from injury, Devontae Wyatt, Quay Walker, and just the Christian Watsons as he comes back from injury. This needs to be a team where we see a little bit more high-end play. I don't think we've seen enough of that so far from this team.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's a team where they've, I think, set a pretty high baseline. There's a lot of talent. There's a lot of guys playing reasonably well, but it's very short on star power right now. And even the star power that it should have is either injured long-term or injured short-term or just, not there. Like David Bakhtiari, I think is still one of the best left tackles in the NFL. He's probably not going to be there now. Jair Alexander at his best is one of the best corners in the NFL. He's been hurt. So even the star power that they do have has not been on the field as much as they needed to. But with all these young guys, that's, I think, one of the things they're going to have to kind of cross their fingers on a little bit is that one or two of them isn't just a good player, which is great. I mean, if you're able to draft guys and they become good NFL starters, that's fantastic. And if you're able to
Yeah.
do that across the board, you're the best drafting team in the NFL. But you're right, to get to the next level, to get to a clear playoff team or a Super Bowl contending team, Christian Watson needs to become a star, not just a capable, starting wide receiver. Like, he needs to be a superstar so that Romeo Doubs can be what he is right now and be that solid number two, and everybody else down the depth chart. Or Luke Musgrave needs to develop into like the next, Jimmy Graham or whatever it is back at his peak. Like, one of these guys or multiple of these guys needs to become a true superstar for that whole thing to work, because you're right, that kind of is how the league works now. You can actually have a pretty rough looking roster. If the top 5 guys on it are superstars, you're in good shape.
Yeah, very much so. So I think that's something to kind of monitor for everyone for Green Bay the remainder of the season, is do any of those guys make that jump and take that next step into at least close to star power for Green Bay moving forward. Want to transition over to Packers Raiders. Just first of all, your general thoughts on the Raiders through 4 weeks. Has not been a great start to their season. They had to start Aiden O'Connell a week ago. They've got 2 phenomenal players in Devontae Adams, who's a little bit banged up right now, and then of course Max Crosby on the other side of the ball. But thoughts on the Vegas Raiders so far?
Yeah, I don't think it's a good team. As much as Josh McDaniels tries to act like they're right around the corner, they're almost there. I don't think that's true. I think that they're in pretty rough shape. The defense has been more impressive than I expected it to be this year. They've, I think, impressed relative to what I thought they would be. The offense is not in great shape, even with Jimmy Garoppolo there as opposed to Aiden O'Connell. O'Connell didn't look good right away. He actually, like, his errant pass is why Devontae Adams is injured, right? It was a badly thrown ball way behind him, which meant that Adams got clocked in the play and driven into the turf, and that's a shoulder injury. So that didn't go well. Max Crosby is a phenomenal player on the edge. They've got a couple of good players on defense, but overall, I think this is a struggling team that is not in a particularly good spot right now.
If you're a betting man and you have to bet against the Raiders' worst run offense against this Packers run defense, who's given up 2 200-yard games in the past 3 weeks, which one are you taking, and how do you see this game going for the Raiders rushing attack?
Yeah, it's funny. The Raiders' run offense has not done anything this season, but the offensive line is largely the same as it was a year ago. And that was a group that was doing a pretty good job for Josh Jacobs. Now, look, Jacobs did a lot of the heavy lifting himself. I think he had one of the highest broken tackle rates we've ever seen at PFF. Like, he got a ton of yards after contact, all those kinds of things. But there were spaces for him to run last season that just aren't there this year. So, until we see any evidence that's going to change, I would put my money on Green Bay's side of that.
Which is crazy to think about because they've had a really rough start to run defense. But I know it is literal public enemy number 1 in Green Bay for Joe Barry and Matt LaFleur. They are trying everything they can, at least they're saying so, to try to shore up a run defense that has not been good so far. So that'll be an interesting one. If they give up another 200 yards to what is, again, the 32nd rushing attack basically going into this week, I think it's going to be, again, something that is very much under the microscope, and there'll be even more calls for Joe Barry's tenure to be done than there are right now in Green Bay. I want to ask you just in general about this matchup. We talked about the rushing attack versus the Packers run defense, Max Crosby, Devontae Adams. We'll see if Adams is a full go this week, but anything else you're sort of watching for as this game gets set to take off on Monday?
No, I mean, honestly, if they can just figure out a way of making Max Crosby not be a factor in this game, it should be, I think, a reasonably comfortable game for Green Bay. They just can't have what happened against the Lions happen again. One guy in Crosby's case, or the entire defensive line take over and start ruining everything they're trying to do. That they gave up, I think, more pressure or about the same amount of pressure in that one game as they'd given up the 3 games previously combined. Okay, look, it's a different personnel group than it was week 1, but that's what you're dealing with now, right? So if that is the new state of play, the Packers have some major problems on offense, particularly going up against a guy as good as Max Crosby. But if they can take that away, if they can go back to even splitting the difference and just being a pretty solid offensive line, the Raiders defense is not good enough to prevent them having some success from that side of the ball. And then the other side, the Raiders offense, I don't think is tremendously scary, particularly with that run game. If it's not firing, I feel like the Packers should be a better team in this.
I think so too. And I think that's the hope. And it's not like the Raiders always get a huge home field advantage playing in Vegas. I expect there to be a ton of Packer fans there. So we'll see what it ultimately amounts to. But this should be a game just on paper that Green Bay has a lot of the advantages. Again, assuming they can make sure that the Max Crosbys and the Devontae Adams aren't the two that ultimately beat them in this game. Kind of wanted to look at the NFC North in general too, and more specifically the Chicago Bears. It's hard not to watch the Chicago Bears right now because of all the things that are going on. Just your general takeaways on the Bears and another brutal loss against the Broncos. Matt Eberflus, does he survive a loss against Washington? There's been some buzz about that. And just how worried should maybe the NFL and the Packers in general be if they ultimately get the top 2 picks in the NFL draft, which is trending in that direction right now?
Yeah, they were much better last week, and it still wasn't enough. And it was against the Denver defense. It's, abysmal and the worst defense in the NFL. So Justin Fields looked better. I think he made some better decisions. He was actually putting the ball in the air when he read it, which is not something that's been happening the rest of the season. And yet it was still a couple of really bad Justin Fields mistakes that ends up costing the game and sort of throwing it away and meaning that it didn't matter. So I don't know when it's going to happen, but at some point, Matt Eberflus is going to be the sacrificial lamb for this, right? And the guy, the scapegoat. The question will be what happens to Ryan Poles. And that I think is that's like, they're going to have 2 questions going into the draft, assuming they end up with the first and second pick or even anything approaching that. The first is going to be, what do we do with these draft picks? Do we draft Caleb Williams? If we're drafting Caleb Williams, do we grab Marvin Harrison or do we grab an offensive lineman? There's that whole dynamic. But before you get to that, there's going to be from ownership, do we want Ryan Poles doing this, right? Like and it's a tough answer. I don't know that there's a good answer to that, because I think from a process standpoint, a lot of what he's done is smart. He's stripped down the roster. He just let's take it all the way back and let's build up from nothing again. Not paying Roquan Smith, etc. Like, there are a lot of good, smart things. They amass draft capital, they amass salary cap space. And I think the move to go with Justin Fields as the starter and pick up a DJ Moore and extra draft picks along the way, I think that was the right call. But he's also made mistakes along the way as well, which make you go, I don't know if he's the guy to make this decision going forward. The Chase Claypool trade is proving to be an absolute disaster. They end up trading what ended up being the 32nd overall pick for a guy that they just want out of the building now. They don't even care if they get anything back in terms of trade. They're just like, whatever happens, just don't show up anymore. I don't care how it's going to end, whether somebody trades something or we have to cut you, but just don't come in anymore. You're more of a pain than you're worth. So that was bad. The draft picks that they've made haven't necessarily come good. Taking the money that you save on Roquan Smith and then throwing it towards Tremaine Edmonds doesn't make any sense to me either, particularly not when the defensive line is still terrible. So there's a lot of bad mistakes that would make you go, I mean, you've done good here, but you've also done bad here. I don't know if you're the guy to make what is going to be one of the most franchise-defining, decisions that any team has had in a long period of time.
Such an interesting discussion, because I'm with you. I thought they sort of hedged with Fields, right? You give Fields another year, you give him a new offensive tackle in Darnell Wright, you get him a DJ Moore, and if it works, awesome. You've got your new starting quarterback and everything's good. And if it doesn't work, you're probably going to be one of the worst teams in football. You get an extra first-round pick from Carolina, who might also be one of the worst teams in football.
Yeah, which is key, right? That's part of this whole thing. You can't just say, well, you got it wrong. You said Justin Fields would be the guy, because part of that bet is getting the extra first-round pick next year, so that if you're wrong, you're now positioned to basically be guaranteed to have a shot at Caleb Williams. Even if these picks end up being, number 3 and number 5, you're still you're close enough that with 2 draft picks, you can go get the guy you want and not, mortgage the entire farm for the next 5 years. So you have to that has to be seen as one holistic thing, that it was a gamble on Justin Fields, and the Fields part of that is coming up snake eyes. But the insurance policy that you built in is a big part of that gamble.
Yeah, and you understand it too, because the worst thing you could have had happened is you jettison Justin Fields and then he goes somewhere else and tears it up, and then you're like, all right, well, we just blew that opportunity too. So there's always that fear. And then to your point though, when I was looked at it this offseason, it was like they started with the number 1 overall pick and $100 million in salary cap space, and I was like, I love the process up until that point. And I didn't hate the trade moving down and getting DJ Moore. I thought they did some good things. But when I kind of looked at it in totality at the end, it's like, all right, they got a couple off-ball linebackers. They got a right tackle. They did get the future first-round pick, a DJ Moore, but like I just kind of left a little bit underwhelmed when you have the first overall pick and $100 million. And part of that was the insurance policy that, again, they have moving forward. But I'm with you. It's a really interesting situation in Chicago. I don't know if they like fire Eberflus in season. Their defensive coordinator's gone. Their offensive coordinator's like public enemy number one in Chicago. They don't have any logical choice. I can only assume Jeff Saturday's the next guy up. That would be great. I'm just kidding. But I don't know where they go at this point. It's such an interesting decision and dynamic.
No, I mean, I think, the coaching staff, it's just a matter of time until they're gone. The only question is, does it happen in season? How long? Or is it the end of season? Everybody gets fired. But Ryan Poles, I think, becomes the very interesting decision, because I think you can construct a perfectly reasonable case in either direction. If you wanted to argue, let the guy finish what he started. He did this stuff that's good from a process standpoint. He, went in the right direction in a bunch of different ways. Cool. That makes sense. And now, like, this is the reward for that, right? You get number one and number two. Go make that decision. Show us where you're going to take this team. But if you wanted to construct the argument that says, look, he's made too many mistakes to be trusted with number one and number two overall, I can't have that. We're going to have to find somebody else to do that. I'd buy that case as well. Like, I think either side of that is a reasonable argument to make.
I think it has to come down to culture. If they feel like he is the part of the process of fixing the culture in Chicago and just bringing a winning dynamic back, then you probably stay. If you feel like he has been part of the same issues that's been going on and the Claypool piece is a part of that, then I think you probably just have to start ripping it down again and going in a different direction. But it is going to be really interesting. It probably gets worse before it gets better in Chicago. Really quick, when we were talking about Packers offensive line before, I did need to mention Elton Jenkins did practice on Tuesday. So that could be a huge help to the Packers against that Raiders defensive front this week. It'll be interesting to see that right guard spot. John Runyon Jr. is now banged up. He is in the he's been with the rehab group on Tuesday's practice. So they could get their left guard back, lose their right guard, and then they have the opportunity again, an option of, do they go with Royce Newman again? Do you go with last year's third round pick, Sean Ryan? Do you put Zach Tom at right guard and put Yosh Nijman at right tackle? They're going to have to figure that all out, but they could still get a really nice piece back with Elton Jenkins this week. Sam, before I let you go, tell everyone about the PFF NFL podcast and where we can find all of your work.
Yeah, the wherever you get your podcasts, we do a big review and a big preview show every week where we go through every single game of the NFL week. And then we also have 3 more shows, 5 days a week that we're on now. So go check that out on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.
They do phenomenal work. You can follow him on Twitter at PFF_Sam. You can find me at Andy Herman NFL. That is going to do it for us today. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.